Hello everyone, it's Booksy. I'm going to be talking about the macro fractal pattern on AMC today. So before I begin, let me just do a quick recap of what the fractal is and what it isn't. I've got a lot of confusion about maybe what a fractal is and what it isn't. And I made a video about fractals and the basics of fractals. So if you want to go check it out, it's on my channel. That's something that can be really helpful if you don't understand the concept of scalability, of the way that volume and other variables might affect a fractal so that they don't look the same, even though they may be very much the same. And it's not so much about copying, bars patterns, which you can do in AMC, and it can be helpful if you're just going to look and try to estimate perhaps what the motion might look like. But fractals will very rarely follow one-to-one bars patterns for anything. And you can get pretty close again, but it's not perfect. But, so that might lead you to say, well, what's the point? I mean, if you have all these other methods of doing TA, why would you choose to focus on the fractals? And the main reason that I'm focused on the fractals is because I think that there are patterns in this stock that we're able to recognize, and they give me a context for where we are and where we might be going. Today's a great example. So this was really scary, this dip here today. But if you were to look at an R1, almost all of the R1 fractals will have this kind of dip at the very end before they tend to go back up. And this is consistent with other things like Wyckoff theory, right? Wyckoff accumulation schematics, which often will have a final push down for accumulation, and often this is called the spring or a last point of support, depending on what stage you're in. And so it's a very normal pattern. And when I look at the fractals, it gives me a way of understanding it in terms of sort of a linear sequence, right? From like A to B. And so if I look at this fractal right here, and this is kind of the one that I like the most, it goes from July 16th till about September 30th, I guess, beginning of October. And it can be interchangeable. I mean, you could just look at this point as a start and this is a stop. I mean, you can kind of move it wherever you want. You can slide these around. But the fractal lengths do change speed. Like this one only went to about this region right here. And so they're not as simple as like copy and paste. But what this is basically says that this action from A over here all the way to B over here, even though it looks very complex, it's a repeated action. And so when you get to the next section, the way they move from A to B is exactly the same fractal. Now, we can tell just by looking at it, this doesn't look exactly the same as this. But if I were to do a side-by-side comparison, it becomes more and more apparent that these are in fact the same fractal, and you'll even see the micro moves are very similar, albeit they're not exactly the same. And going even further, I was able to identify that within this larger fractal, there's actually another fractal right here. So we're kind of left with this idea that not only are fractals scalable, but they iterate within themselves, meaning that they repeat within a whole fractal cycle, like a macro fractal cycle or a medium scale fractal cycle. They repeat on basically an infinitely smaller level. And as you go along, things can become very, very difficult to track if you're in a really volatile area. So right now, if you hear something rattling, the cat toy. I may have to take it away if they get too crazy. Right now, we're in an area that doesn't seem to be a repeating area, right? But if you look, I postulated and I put it out in another video that perhaps this is an overlapping cycle and there were two starts, and you can map two different fractal cycles from this point on. And so there's sort of one that started up, that starts here and begins, but then there was another one where this right here is not this, but this is actually another complete cycle. So there was a complete cycle in here, and then it's mapping out. And that's very confusing. But again, if you go check out that other video, I think it could be really helpful to understanding what I mean by that when I say that they're overlapping. So that being said, this right here, this action Okay, it's basically this action right here. And what we're looking for now is how do we get down to the bottom? So the B4 is this final move down. And I believe that we're in it right now. I don't know if we're out of the woods yet. There is the possibility that the spring needs to go lower. And the lower spring could be, it kind of looks like we maybe hit 33 or almost hit 32. Maybe we did barely 32.75, something like that. And I'm just looking at these past levels of support and resistance just to get an idea of like where we may bounce. But see how far down this was? This was $29. And it's entirely possible that this push could go even further than that. And I don't want it to, but it would be consistent with Wyckoff, and it would result in a very large move up and out of this wedge if that were the case. Right now, it seems to be consolidating, so it may be done. We'll see. The point is that when you look at a fractal, you can tell a lot of things about a move, and you can kind of anticipate what may be coming next. And you can do that if you know where you are in the fractal. And I mentioned that this is one of the benefits. It's also one of the limitations because fractals repeat, it can be very tricky, and you can find yourself thinking that you're in one place and really you're in another. And that's part of the genius of fractals and algorithmic fractals, is that they make themselves difficult to describe. Like they make themselves hidden and not simple to interpret. And so you could really easily get mixed up and not know exactly where you are, especially if the fractal does something you're not expecting, right? Maybe it was, and in this case, we were mapping this to this area, the T's, because we thought that this was this action, and it was, and it mapped 1-to-1. But then if you look closely, you'll note that these actions right here also look a lot like the T's. And that's something that I'm still learning about, is when we see this action, what is really going on? Like, what's the purpose of this? Because it's both here and here used to test certain levels. But in this case, you're testing levels in the lower, tighter region, working your way to a liquidity test. And in this case, you're doing a sell test, right? And you're burning the stock down. And so they're very different actions, but the fractals are the same. Like the micro fractal in these regions and these regions are the same. So this is kind of where I'm at, right? And I decided I was going to go and look at, with this fractal theory, look at the macro. So here's the macro. And, you know, you're just looking at basically this region, right? And I'm trying to see if I can map this fractal to the larger scale. So I'm going to hide this for a minute. I'm going to go to the daily, because you don't really need to zoom in on anything. And I'm just going to look at this. And immediately you might assume what I assumed, which is that this is an R1 and then this is an R2. That these are push-ups, right? And sure enough, the first time that I did it, and I'm going to pull up an example for you. Hang on a second. I want to do that. The first time that I did it wrong. And I have it here still somewhere. Incorrect. This is the one. Okay. And this is the way that I mapped it. Now, don't get all panicky about this stuff. We'll get to that later in the video. But just so you know, all I did was I assumed that, again, we had this R1, okay, that this was the R2, and then this was circled because this is where we are. And I thought, we're in the R2. And you remember back when I was saying that I thought we were going to just keep going up from the top? This is why. So I already kind of had an idea that we were playing out a macro. And I was thinking that perhaps this right here, if it's part of the R2 where we are, so when we were in this region, right here, right in this upper region, I was thinking that, oh, okay, well, maybe we're in the, maybe we're in that region, you know, like maybe we're in that section right up here. And I was wrong. I mean, I was just flat out, like that's all there was to it. I was not correct. And not only was I not correct, but then, you know, we get this major sell And it's like, whoa, where are we, right? And I think, again, you have to understand like context, okay? And this follows, and it does, this follows a Wyckoff accumulation schematic. And so if you understand that, then you probably were ready for like a major sell test. I think originally a lot of people thought that it was right here. And then we were like, oh, this might be an SOS coming up, which would be a sign of strength. It didn't really happen. And so it was sort of a false sign of strength. It didn't really work out. And so you have to shift your days around. And that frustrates people. And even I was looking at this and I was like, well, there is a dip, there's a dip below that. So maybe that's, part of that, that dip. But if you're looking at a Wyckoff schematic, and it looked a lot like this dip, right? It looked like it was going to be the same sort of move, and it wasn't. It was like a fake out. And in some ways, if you look at the fractals here, they do match, because the micro fractal from here to here and here to here is basically the same. And that's what is really confusing about a lot of these moves, is that, again, things sort of run together and they all look the same. Well, after I sort of played around with this idea for a while, I started feeling like nothing was really lining up. Again, I wrongfully sort of tried to predict what might happen here, that we would end up, just pushing out of this rising wedge. And I based this on, I think this is March. This is one of the March fractals. And, I'm looking at it thinking, well, if that's the case, there's a lot of bad implications, because if this right here, and I'm going to get out of this for just a second, go back to the chart. If this right here is an R1, and this is supposedly the ape movement, right? And the buy button getting stopped, then it seems pretty fabricated, right? It would mean that it was all sort of made up or fluff. And that's very disturbing stuff to talk about. But it doesn't really seem out of place, right? It makes it so that this looks very much like it's where it's supposed to be. And that would mean that, consequently, you can make your own decisions about what that actually means. I don't think it necessarily means that there wouldn't be a short squeeze. I do think it means that you have to sort of reevaluate the position maybe that you might have towards like this whole thing. But certainly, like, I was like, okay, if that's the R1 and this is the R2, then that has a lot of really big implications for this stock, because we see this pattern playing out. And then recently, I made a discovery, and it's right here. You see this? We said this looks like the same fractal here and here, and they are very similar. All right, but this move right here in particular, and I'll talk about this more in a minute. I'll come back around to this. This is what convinced me that this is actually a T3, and that this move is quite the interruption. It is quite the big deal. So that being said, let me go ahead and show you. This is the way I've mapped it, and I could be wrong about some things. I'm not really worried about this area so much. Don't really care. I just wanted to see, like, hey, are there sort of these head and shoulder patterns? And you probably can map this differently, but this is really common for the head and shoulders, right? Is that you get these head and shoulders, and I know you're like, that doesn't look like head and shoulders. Well, it's not perfect, but if you were to map through here, you can see that there was actually a higher head than a shoulder and the shoulders. And then this right here, this little ledge, is really common before you move into the catch. It sort of makes it look like it's about to turn up, and then it just drops. So I'm more concerned not about this area, but what is going to happen in the future, and what does that mean now in the present? And of course, you can't tell the future, but we can look at this and just say some things objectively. So one thing is that this little volcano pattern appears all over the place in this stock, as does the sort of 1, 2, 3 sell-off, which if you zoomed in, you'd see it here and here. Well, you see it here, all right? It's more like this. Okay, there's the 1, the 2, and the 3. And then it was setting up right here. You can see it was setting up for the T3. And again, I'll come back to this in a little bit when I talk about like the proof of this, like why do I think I'm correct, so that people can't just say, I'm just saying, trust me, right? I don't think that's fair anyways. So I'm going to come back to that. But you can see it was setting up for the T3. It was interrupted. the T3 finished, and it like the T3 is a platform, right, for pushing up, and then the R1 is just another accumulation or a reaccumulation. It sort of stops the move. It does a little sell-off, and then it starts accumulating again, getting ready for another big move, and that's when you get into like Wyckoff stuff. And then after that, we have the R2, and the R2 is a weird one because if the initial move is quite large, here's where I'm going with this. All right, I'm just going to go ahead and say it. You have on every single one of these, all right, you have a target, and the target is typically this R3 and R4 region up here. Okay, and the R1, I'm not saying it's up here at like $300. Okay, I don't think that's where it was. It probably, if you look at the volatility of this thing, like maybe it was pretty high, but I doubt it was that high. Maybe it was like meant to be more like this, right? More mild. And then it was going to push up to maybe back to the all-time highs around like, what was it, like 40, something like that, 30, 34. Okay. There are other evidences that perhaps this was a target, but I think that it became a target when this stuff started happening and like the ape movement got involved. But I think that the main target is not R1, it's not R2, it's R3 and R4. And this could be way up here, it could be down here. I don't really know. It doesn't have to be anywhere. All right, there's other people who have speculated it's between 135 and 165. If you look at some charts, it looks like it could go up to like 200 plus. The point is not to be super predictive about it, but really just to say, okay, somewhere up here, there's this mythical R3 number. And if this very first move, the R1, right? If the very first move is really big, okay, then the second move may not be as big, because if you're only trying to go from R2 into R3, and R2 is kind of a ramp that leads you up to R3, then you don't need your R2 to be huge, because then you'd end up having to come back down. It's very controlled. All right, it's a very controlled walk up. And if you want some evidence for this, you can just go and look at the charts. Now, I've posted a bunch of these on the internet, on Twitter and stuff. But basically, you know, let's just look at a couple, and I'll show you what I mean. So you see here, here's one. This is an R1, and this one actually comes down quite a bit. And the R2 is pretty small, you know, and it may even be like, if you look at this chart, you could chart it like this or like this. I mean, I don't really think it matters too much. It's definitely more of a bull, but I would say like this right here, probably pretty accurate. And this really region right in this area is your R, maybe even this. This is your R2 really, because it sets you up for the final move up. And you see it doesn't move up very far because look at where we are, right? Relative to right here, okay, relative to where R3 wants to be. And they knew where it wanted to be, okay? They knew where it wanted to be because they didn't want to exceed and have an accidental breakout, right, of this larger, this pattern right here. All right, so they set these limits up. They know where they're going. So if R1 really takes off, then R3 may be more mild. Okay. And here's another one, and you might be starting to get confused because this is an R1, and this is the R1 that maps almost perfectly to where we are currently. And I will get to that in the proof section. But basically, if you look here, this R1, and I'll go on a wider time frame here. It makes it easier to see. Okay, this R1 is pretty steep, but there's a little more distance, right? So the R2, this leg up, becomes this sort of SOS, and then it legs up one more time. But there are other times where, back in the earlier days of the stock, you see a really small, comparatively, like this one is a pretty big, it's a pretty big R1. I mean, maybe part of that is T3, but then the R2 is pretty large, and the R3 is decent size too. But then there's other more mild ones, right? Where like on this one, I think this one has one where, is that it? Yeah. All my charts are like missing, but there's one here where the R2 is actually much larger than the R1. And the point of this is not to say like, I know what's going to happen. All I'm saying is that I don't know what's going to happen, because when you're looking at this, because the R1 and the R2 are relative to R3. So it's like A plus B equals R2 plus, here, I'll just put it on here. R1 plus R2 equals R3. And I mean, what I mean by that is not that if you add those numbers together, it's just that, you know, you have these two moves and they both have to be proportionate relative to wherever R3 is going. So if R3 ends up being like right here, which would be a bummer, like 130, then R2 is going to be pretty low. You know, I don't think it's going to be very high. If R3 is a bit higher, then I think you're going to get a little bit of a larger R2. And if R3 was like astronomically high, and this is like MOAS type stuff, then yeah, I think the R2 would be pretty darn significant, right? Before we settle and then we move up again. Yeah, because you're trying to like make up the distance between the bottom and the top here. So that being said, I don't have a lot of strong opinions right this second about it. I think that if you look at Wyckoff, if this becomes, let's say this region right here between 72 and 52, if this becomes sort of our R2, and like where we push out here, this becomes the run 2, then I do think maybe you have an extended period of consolidation before you finally move up to R3, which could be up here, it could be lower, higher, I don't know. But certainly that's possible. Okay. And then after that, you would expect a retracement. And this is also consistent with Wyckoff, where you have, you know, basically you come back down, you have a spring, and then you have a test, and then you do it all over again. And that's basically what these were. Okay, a spring and a test, and then you go. And so that would be certainly a possibility. From here, you know, there are possibilities that are endless. And I'm not really in the mood I'm kind of in a grumpy mood today. But I'm not really in the mood to speculate too much on the direction it could go after. I do think that if the ape community stays with AMC, I don't see why this can't just keep legging up. It will, because as long as they can run these accumulation schematics on it, you know, and maybe this goes more sideways and up. If a lot of people sell off up here and they don't buy back in, then, and I don't mean they have to hold the whole way. I'm just saying if they sell and they never buy back, or if institutions sell and they never buy back, a lot of things could happen. I mean, on the one hand, if this thing were to drop pretty low, let's say like down to the $14 mark or something, right? By the way, B4 tends to go back to wherever we broke out a T3. So you could draw it like this and say it's $20, or you could draw it like this and say it's 14. It doesn't make a difference at this point, but that's typical for B4, is to go back down to wherever we broke out with T3. And so my guess would be about 20. And then, you know, you end up, if institutions were to sell off, let's say they push it lower, you could have this kind of chain reaction where a lot of the shorts who have been in here since before, they're like, all right, I'm done, I'm getting out. And then it ends up causing like a really huge short squeeze. Okay. I think this can operate within Wyckoff and within the MOAS narrative, this map that I made, because these are things that are possibilities, right? And certainly with the Wyckoff, that if it continues to have buyers with retail, if it continues to have life, if they continue improving on the fundamentals of the stock and all that jazz, and, you know, those are not as important as just the schematics working out. If they can make money on this, they're going to keep going. Okay. So this is kind of where I'm at right now. I haven't charted anything because I don't feel comfortable with that right now. I don't know how big R2 will be. I don't know if it's going to need to consolidate. Sometimes, and just that's it, right? And then move into R3. Sometimes you get this sort of move. I'll show you two options. Sometimes you get this push up, and then you get this sort of consolidation, and then it doesn't really do a whole lot. It kind of goes up and down, and then eventually you get this kind of break all the way up to maybe wherever R3 is. And then if I'm looking at the schematic, I say this is the R2 because it created like a little T3 platform. So that's a possibility. Another possibility is that you incrementally leg up. So that would be like also a real possibility, and it would look like bull flags essentially, where you get these tiny little flags, and then you leg up to like 72, and then you move up again, maybe to like right under 200 or something, and then you finally go up to the final area where you're going to do your. That's also possible, you know. So you get these series of little flags. Because the fractals played both ways. The important thing to note is that the R2 is not the end. And even once you get to like the T4 and R3, you still get another push usually for the R4. Sometimes it starts selling off before then. And then we have, you know, the possibility of a short squeeze. And certainly like that's not something to just scoff at with this stock, because there are a lot of people who are probably in these positions, larger institutions, and just speculating, you know, but saying that they've been in for a while and they're trying to ride this thing all the way up and all the way back down. And I think that's the big point here is they want to get it, they want to get out, right? And as long as retail continues to have interest in the stock, it's going to make it very, very difficult to drive this ever back down, especially down to these regions. Like, it's just not going to happen. If retail abandons the stock, and I'm talking about more than just the apes, just in general, I mean, everybody, right? If they abandon it, somehow it's going to go back down, right? And they're going to, whoever wants to can cover, you know, at these lower levels. But for now, I think that this schematic will keep playing out, maybe not sideways, but more or less up, right? So maybe it doesn't look the same, but if you were to copy and paste this over here, and it just kind of keeps moving up, I do think long-term, you're talking about some pretty serious numbers. So final part of this video is doing a proof. And I like to do this because I think that a lot of folks are skeptical. They don't like that when people get stuff wrong. And so they see me post something and then it doesn't turn out the way I say it is. And it just looks like I don't know what I'm talking about and that the fractals are pointless. And also just a lot of people have said a lot of stuff, right? And it's easy to like point and say, this looks like this, like it does. And that's because they're repeating fractals in there. And that's why it looks almost exactly the same. But it's better if you look at it from a more micro point of view and then go backwards. Because if a fractal is a trading pattern that reflects the behavior of a stock, that the way institutions trade it, the way retail trades it, the way market makers do their manipulation thing, right? If they all combining, right, relationally to create this pattern, this algorithmic pattern, then it makes sense that we would have some very, very obvious similarities between micro movements that happen almost every other day, right? Like they can be tiny every second micro movements because we have high frequency trading. So like more moderate movements that take place over a week or a month to the macro movements. So what I did is I basically looked at this T3 area when I recognized this pattern right here. And I'll show you the pattern right there, okay? This was a pattern that I couldn't get it out of my head, right? Because we all thought that's what was going on up here, but it didn't play out that way. And I thought to myself, well, if we're in a R1, then if we're in an R2, then this right here, this region should look like the R2 regions. But the R2s always look like just an SOS. Like they don't, I mean, and maybe you can look at this and say that's what this is on the macro, but the proof, the problem with that is that it could be the case, right? But then if I'm just looking at fractals, it would surely line up somewhere. And the truth of the matter is that the SOS, whatever you want to call them, the R2, they are not at all like what we're dealing with right now. And that's why I was reluctant to talk about this like messed up one, because this right here didn't really make a lot of sense to me, because this is like an R2, and this doesn't look anything like, even on like the most basic fractal level, it really doesn't match up with this region. And the R1 region kind of looks like this. There's some similarities, just like there are some kind of similarities between this region and this region, but it also didn't really match up. And so I was left in a place where I'm looking at these R2s. Here's another one. See, it's just kind of all over the place. And this is one that kind of stair steps. This is what I was talking about. There's two different ones, right? One that's pretty much just like sideways and then it goes up. Another that really comes up and down and then, stair steps up. None of these look like this region right here. And so the theory that I was, pitching to myself was that if this is an R1, and then this must be an R2, this is the leg up and this is some kind of a consolidation before the next leg. And it kind of is, but the point is that it didn't line up with the fractals. And if that's what I'm basing this research on, then I need to figure out where I'm going wrong. And somebody had posted something really odd, and I don't remember exactly who it was, but they posted something odd in the Discord, and I thought, that doesn't look right. And it was this weird line, like right here. And they said something like, every time the stock touches this line, or something like that, like every time it touches this line, it's run, so X% or something like that. And I was like, that's not the best way to look at this thing. Maybe there's some truth to it, but you can draw lines wherever you want and say that this is the magic line, right? So I went and looked it up, and as I was looking it up, I had drawn it wrong or something. I drew it like this, and that's when a lot of this stuff started clicking in my head. So I looked at this and I thought, oh, you know what? I have seen this before. I've seen it on the SOS, or I've seen it on the, excuse me, sorry. I've seen it on the T patterns quite a bit. And so I was looking at specifically like that T3. Here's a good one. Okay, so I found this pattern really obviously similar to, I apologize for that, with this sort of reverse head and shoulders looking thing. And then even if you look at it on like a smaller scale, you can see that you get this sort of dip and then it comes up. See this? Consolidates and then it goes. And it kind of reaches like this previous region. And this really threw me off because I was like, wait a second. This right here, this is the same fractal pattern as this right here. You see that? And so this is part of the T3. What's bizarre is that before this happens, right, you look at this region down here. Before this happens, so if you're looking at this, this is the daily. We can go on to like the 4 hour. Let's go to the 3 hour actually. Maybe we can see it better. There you go. Yeah, I mean, they look very, very similar. Okay, very, very similar. And I thought, well, that's definitely interesting because that looks just like, to some degree, right, what we saw in back in May. And I looked at it and I thought, well, I can't really reconcile the rest of it. This doesn't really make sense. And of course, then you have to just say, well, wait a second. Of course, it doesn't make sense because we didn't have, we were in the middle of this region, and then all of a sudden it dives down and then it shoots up and rockets from $2 or whatever all the way up to $20. And there's nothing comparable to that. And if you look at the chart, and let's say you just like took a make like a really dense looking rectangle. Okay. Let's say you just took something and you went, okay, well, I'm going to just block out this region. Use your brain. You can block it out. And just look at just look at the regions surrounding it. Okay. It would be like that, right? And you see that? It's just like, it's the same. And so, yeah, I mean, you can tell, like, if I were looking at this and I didn't know that this, if I didn't have this region and this region here, you know, this little cell on top of this line, okay, there's even, you can compare it to the dip here, but the point is that the way this traverses this afterwards is basically one-to-one. And knowing that, I decided I would go through and look at all of the T3s because I was like, it's not enough just to map one. So I started looking at all of them. And here's another one. And this one's kind of ugly, but it is the same fractal. And you get that same like dip down, right? And then consolidation above. Okay, here's another one. I think this is the region we just looked at. So here's a comparison, right? And they're definitely like the same. And this U, see this big U here? It is this U right here. It's just that it went way down and then way up before it came back to normal. Here's another one. And this is the one I was just showing you. It looks really bizarre, but it's the same. And I know it sounds really weird when you're looking at it. You don't really think they look the same, but they are. If you track from here and here on, look at that bowl shape. It's the same. This right here is this action, but it looks very different, okay? And then again, you blot out that middle section and you can really see right here, look at this shape. See that little U? That's right here. Now this section is very different than this, but there is a massive cell, massive push up. And then it just goes more sideways, whereas this one was going more up. See this little zigzag? It's up, down, up. This is right here, up, down, up. Okay. And I'm really not trying to fit a square in a round hole here, or round peg in a square hole. I'm just looking at what I'm seeing and I'm just testing it, right? This one's really weird. So I think this section right here is all the T3, but look at this. Doesn't that look familiar? So this one's kind of ugly because I couldn't get a closer time frame. But this is the same fractal, and it does have that same cell and then push, which is a common theme in this stock, and I think it's part of what we're dealing with right now. Here's another one, and these are comparisons that I drew. So I went through and checked all of them, every single T3 I could find. I checked it against the macro to see what I could see. And I mean, look at this. It's the same, right? It's pretty amazing how similar it is. And if you were to look at it on any other time frame, you can kind of see that it does work quite well. But you have to, of course, do the digging for it. It's not a very fun activity. Yep. And this one has a really big kind of push down, but the same thing. I think this is the same as the other one I showed. I just took different pictures of it. So that being said, that was a big reason. And then all I had to do next was test this out, right? Test this hypothesis by going through and looking at the R1 on the macro and comparing it to the R1 on the micro and seeing what I could see. And I went to the more what do you want to call it? I gotta go back. I went to one of the more, I would say, relatively like easy to read. Where is it? Which is the September one? Oh, I can't see it on this one. I'm gonna have to go to the 3-minute. That'll help. Oh, it was that one. I guess it's the one before it. Yeah, here it is. So this is back in September, early September. right at the beginning. And this is the macro that, or the micro fractal that I use to compare to what we're seeing now. And it's the same. So I'm not going to walk through this. It would take a really long time. But suffice to say that we're basically in the midst of this working out. Okay. And yeah, like you can't really tell exactly where we're going to end up. But if you see here, this break below the line is very consistent. If you drew a line from these touch points up through here, just like that, you get that same break. And it doesn't matter how you draw it. You could draw it to the tip on this or to another part, but it's the same. And I've been posting about these on quite a bit on Twitter and stuff, but these are both, the reason that these are both so similar is because the fractals are repeating and they're traded the same way, but they're traded the same way because they're Wyckoff schematics, right? And they are accumulation schematics. Now this one did not dip very far, right, before it decided to leg up. This one may need to dip far. And if you know anything about Wyckoff, you know that it's very possible that you have to dip, you may end up getting a dip back into this zone. And we're just going to have to wait and see. And right now, we just bounced right off the top of this zone. So we're still in kind of like the normal trading range here. We're not into the major accumulation range again, but the liquidity zone. But like basically, I'm not super worried about it, even if we did go all the way down. It does throw off a lot of stuff on the micro because when you're looking at these fractals, it looks like everything's just kind of repeating and repeating and repeating and repeating, and that you can't really tell where you are. But thankfully, you know, I found this, discovered this, that this fractal matches, and so we can monitor it day to day. This right here, I believe is the R1 because it matches the R1. Right? The R1 fractal as it appears on the micro level. And although that might be a little bit backwards, perhaps, than what we always want to think about, it's very consistent with fractal theory because fractals, again, can repeat on micro and macro levels. And I bet if we were to look at micro levels, we could probably find a lot of examples of this as well, the R1 being this very big move. And so I'm not going to go through and show you all the other R1 comparisons. Some of them, you know, are pretty ugly. You know, and this is an example of one that's pretty ugly. You know, and at first glance, you may say it's not the same, but I beg to differ. It is. You see the same kind of upward price movement here, followed by a dip, you know, and a bounce, dip and a bounce. You get another push up after this. You know, you hit this zone here, and you know, and so on and so forth. And even though this is very flat, the peaks and the valleys are all there, which is kind of funny. It's like they're not even really trying very hard. And this major sell, I think right here is the same as this one, or it's this one. I can't remember which is which. But yeah, it works out. And then it does something similar when you get to this region, right? It has this sort of major break down, and it doesn't really matter how you draw it. Anyways, that's kind of my proof for why I think this is the R1. I'm not going to go into the proof for the whole fractal. That would be silly. I'd have to just keep going forever and ever. But basically, it matches the R1 fractal that we see on the micro level. And to me, like that's pretty substantial evidence that you have not only a match of the T3, that not only was able to match the T3 to this move, this being like the platform, but then if you get rid of this right here, right, who knows? This whole fractal could have been like, and maybe it was not ever going to be this quite this steep. Now, I know you're looking at it like, well, look at that line. It lines up perfectly. And I agree. That is kind of spooky. But I think at this point, probably a lot of the apes had already stepped in, right? So they get this major amount of volatility early on in the stock. But maybe originally, just a thought, but maybe originally they were thinking it was going to be like this, right? And then kind of go along this way. Because the T3s don't usually step up that hard. And if you were looking at just the general trend of this, it kept some of it, but I think we probably would have seen the T3 below here, and then maybe you would R1 up to like here to $20. If that was maybe $19 or $20 was the target for the R1. But definitely this looks interruptive. And if you got rid of, I already showed you that, but if you got rid of this section, you wouldn't have nearly as much complaint as I did anyways about this being the T3, but it definitely, to me, appears to be the T3. So, as always, not financial advice, just my opinion, but I do think this gives us a context because now we can go and map, like I did, right? And I've been posting about it, like we can map the R1 and we can see how the different R1s have navigated the Wyckoff schematic, the accumulation schematic for the region, which gives us more information about what we could expect for price action. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will catch you all in the next one.